Good morning. Today we're looking at the Sermon on the Mount, which appears in Matthew chapters 5 to 7 and Luke 6 verses 17 to 49. The Sermon on the Mount was given by Jesus near the start of his ministry on earth, after his baptism and temptation. We're told that Jesus was travelling near the Sea of Galilee, and he started to speak primarily to his disciples about what it means to follow him. Matthew says Jesus went up on a mountainside and gathered his core disciples around him. The rest of the crowd had to find places along the side of the hill or at the bottom of the hill in order to hear what Jesus was saying, but the content of what he was saying was aimed mainly at his disciples. This sermon is by far Jesus' longest explanation of what it's like to be part of God's kingdom. In many ways, Jesus' teachings during the Sermon on the Mount represent the major ideals or precepts of the Christian life. The Sermon on the Mount is the first of 5 great discourses or sermons in Matthew. And Brian Phillips says Matthew uses these 5 sermons to structure and frame his gospel. He says Matthew links them to much of the Old Testament and shows how Jesus is fulfilling the Old Testament prophecies and the ceremonial law. So these 5 discourses, the first one, as we've said, is the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapters 5 to 7, and this is linked to Exodus and the giving of the law to Moses. The second one is the commissioning of the 12 in chapter 10, where Jesus sends out the disciples to cast out satanic demons, disease and affliction. This links to Numbers 13, where the 12 spies are sent out to assess how best to cast out the enemy people in the promised land. Then the third one is the parables of the kingdom in chapter 13, parables of the sower, the weeds, the mustard seed, the hidden treasure, the pearl of great price. And this is linked to the wisdom of Solomon. And there is a direct quote in Matthew 12:42 that says Jesus is greater than Solomon. The fourth one is talking of the church in chapter 18, where Jesus instructs his disciples on how they are to live. This community of faithful disciples can be compared to the community Elijah and Elisha established in the Old Testament. Then the final one is called the Olivet Discourse, and it appears in chapters 23 to 25 of Matthew. And this links to Jeremiah. Jesus verbally attacks the priests and leaders, the scribes, Pharisees and hypocrites in chapter 23, uttering 7 prophetic woes against them in the temple, just as Jeremiah did in his temple sermons in Jeremiah 7 and 26. So in Matthew you get this reference to the Old Testament, with Jesus clearly showing who he is and was in Old Testament times and what he had come to do on earth. Matthew's writing is in contrast to Luke. Remember, Luke was the doctor. I'm not sure if that's significant or not, but Luke was much more of a plain speaker. So instead of blessed are the poor in spirit, you simply get blessed are the poor. Luke only has 4 much more straightforward blessings, followed by 4 woes, which is the antithesis or the exact opposite of the blessings. And though they're very similar to the Beatitudes at the start of the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew, they are less poetic and more direct. In Matthew, the Sermon on the Mount starts with these Beatitudes. Some scholars say that Matthew was proposing Jesus as a new Moses, and the Beatitudes were like new 10 commandments. This links to what we said earlier about the 5 discourses. There are certainly parallels, and particularly after the Beatitudes later in Matthew 5, when Jesus talks about murder and adultery and divorce, etc., there are echoes of Exodus and the 10 Commandments. We're studying Exodus in House Group, and we've looked at the section where God gives the law to Moses. When we looked particularly at chapters 21 to 23, it appears that Moses was giving God's law or judgments on disputes that had happened within the community of the children of Israel. The law in this context was a way of sorting out disputes. I would suggest Jesus is doing much more than that here. He's giving more of a blueprint of what it means to follow him and be part of his kingdom. Grant Etheridge talks about the Beatitudes and says, Jesus is giving ways to live so that we can live a happy and blessed life. The world doesn't reward the kind of living Jesus is talking about, but God does. The world says, you're blessed when all your dreams come true. You're blessed when everything goes your way. Jesus said, happy, or more than happy, blessed, are the sad and the broken-hearted. This turns the world on its head. In fact, everything that Jesus said in the Sermon of the Mount turns worldly things upside down. The perspective is completely altered. Jesus is telling us to look at the way we live completely differently. The Beatitudes, particularly in Matthew, are poetic, and if you take them at face value, they don't seem to make sense. So I thought if we look at one of them in more detail, we might be able to unpick it a little. There is one beatitude in particular that has always fascinated me, and I wanted to concentrate on this one. It's Matthew 5, verse 4. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Some of what I've read suggests that you're blessed if you mourn or are sorrowful for your sin, as you'll be comforted by the forgiveness of Jesus. And there's definitely an element of that, and that is certainly true. But I do think there is more to it than just that. Natural sorrow is a part of us. I'm completely sure each one of us has experienced sorrow or grief or loss. God made us with the capacity to cry. Many people cried in the Bible, as did Jesus. The shortest verse in the Bible, Jesus wept, John 11:35, is set when Jesus visits Martha and Mary when Lazarus has died. Jesus wept for the pain of his friends. Jesus deeply cared about Mary, Martha and Lazarus. Although he already knew that he would raise Lazarus from the dead, he felt their pain. Jesus also wept because he could see that the disciples and Martha and Mary didn't fully understand or have enough faith in him. Jesus deliberately waited to go to Lazarus so that God could be glorified, and his disciples and Martha and Mary would see Lazarus brought back to life to show them who he was. Remember, he said, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? That's John 11:25-26. But Jesus also wept because the death of Lazarus and his resurrection reflected his own. Jesus knew a short time after this he too would die and be placed in a tomb. He knew he would ultimately overcome death and rise from the dead just like Lazarus. But he also knew it would be extremely painful and difficult in so many ways. From this one short verse, we can see that grief is complicated. It's good to reflect as well that Jesus wept and suffered and died so that one day we don't have to. Revelation 21:4 encourages us in this hope for the future. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away. There's also that lovely bit in Ecclesiastes 3:4 that says, there is a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance. Could it be that God uses tears to heal a broken heart? You might think it's not right to cry, but even Paul said it was okay to have sorrow, but not as those who have no hope, i.e. not as those in the world. 1 Thessalonians 4:13 says, do not grieve like the rest of mankind who have no hope. John Stott, in his book on Thessalonians, says that Paul doesn't forbid us to grieve. It would be unnatural, indeed inhuman, not to mourn when we lose somebody near and dear to us. To be sure, it is appropriate at Christian funerals joyfully to celebrate Christ's decisive victory over death, but we do so only through tears of personal sorrow. It's hopeless grief that Paul is against. We should not mourn as the world does, but as Jesus mourned for Lazarus, knowing that it wasn't the end, but rather the beginning of something new. This hope that Paul talks about is different. We might understand hope in worldly terms as something we want, but are not sure about or not certain of. For example, I might want to go to the beach and the forecast is rain. I might hope it doesn't rain and go to the beach anyway, but I'm highly unlikely to peg out the washing before I go, because I hope it won't rain, but I think it might. The hope Paul talks about, our hope, is reflected in the hymn Jesus is King and I will extol him. The second verse says, we have a hope that is steadfast and certain. This hymn is based on Hebrews 6:9. The Amplified Bible puts it this way: this hope, this confident assurance, we have as an anchor of the soul. It cannot slip and it cannot break down under whatever pressure bears upon it. It is a safe and steadfast hope that enters within the veil of the heavenly temple, that most holy place in which the presence of God dwells. And that is comforting indeed when we mourn. This godly or spiritual hope is very different to the hope in the world, almost the opposite. It turns the world on its head. So I can clearly see that if we mourn in this way we will be comforted, but why are we blessed if we mourn? I looked at the meaning of the word blessed. I've said it could be described as more than happy, and especially in worldly terms it could be described as more than happy, but in spiritual terms, and actually in the dictionary, blessed means holy or consecrated or dedicated or set apart to be holy. So if we mourn with the hope that Jesus has given us, then we're set apart as holy. But what does it mean to mourn in a holy way? Perhaps the key to this lies in the rest of the Sermon on the Mount when talking about the law, or aspects of the law that appear in Exodus, but are very much changed here in Matthew. An example of this is in Matthew 5:38-41, which says, "You have heard it said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. The bit about eye for an eye appears in Exodus 21, and if I read from verse 22, I think you'll see what I mean about the law Exodus was given was to settle disputes that had actually happened. Verse 22 of Exodus 21 says, "If people are fighting and hit a pregnant woman and she gives birth prematurely, but there is no serious injury, the offender must be fined whatever the woman's husband demands and the court allows." So that surely speaks of something that's happened. But if there is serious injury, you are to take life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. So this seems at complete variance with what Jesus is saying. He seems to be saying, if someone hits you and you lose an eye, turn your face and let him hit you again, and you may even lose your other eye. This is completely upside down to what the world would say. The world would say if someone hits you and you lose an eye, then that's assault, and the person who hit you needs to be prosecuted and go to prison. So is Jesus saying allow people to injure you and hurt you? Is he saying grit your teeth and don't retaliate? Allow and even encourage people to attack you? I don't think he's saying this at all. I think he's saying that if you're following Jesus and are part of his kingdom, then whatever the world does to you won't matter. It can't touch you because you are safe and secure in Jesus. What the world thinks of you or does to you won't matter to you because you are set apart to be holy. In essence, you won't care what the world thinks or does because it won't matter to you. That to me speaks of real freedom. You're not bound by the world, not a slave to its demands and practices. You are free in the love Jesus has for you. So in this sense, Jesus is not giving us laws to be slavishly obeyed. It's not a question of stoically forcing yourself to turn the other cheek. It's more that if someone sets out to hurt you or injure you, they won't have the effect they are wanting, because what they do to you won't matter to you. You are free from it. I've also heard it said that turning the other cheek makes us a doormat and allows people to walk all over us. I don't think that's true either. You can only be a doormat if you feel like a doormat. If you feel downtrodden and affronted, then you will be downtrodden and affronted. If whatever anyone does to injure you doesn't touch you, doesn't matter to you, then you can't take on the mantle of the doormat. You're free from it. Instead of soaking up hurt and injury in weakness, you are actually now in a position of great strength, and it gives us a freedom that is just not present in the world. Matthew 6:19-21 says, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moths and vermin destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moths and vermin do not destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." I think this is key. Where your heart is set, that is what will matter to you. If your heart is with Jesus, as his heart is with us, then nothing of the world will affect us, matter to us, or have the ability to hurt us. This is truly turning the world on its head. I do know this isn't easy, and I know there have been many, many times when I have allowed the world to affect me, where I have taken offence, where I have put worldly things above spiritual things. I know I'm not perfect, but one day I will be. One day I'll be with Jesus and not have to try and hold on to kingdom values, not try to hang on to the anchor, because I'll be with Jesus in a perfect heaven. Also, remember, Jesus grieved, and it's okay to hurt. We just need to remember and hold on to the hope that underpins our lives. I found this expression or paraphrase of the Beatitudes, which I think are good to sum up what I'm trying to say. The one that jumps out to me is, "Let people off the hook even when they don't deserve it. This ultimately sets you free." The Sermon on the Mount finishes with the parable of the wise and foolish builders in Matthew 7, verses 24-27. This says, "Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against the house. Yet it didn't fall because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and doesn't put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. This shows how permeable and shakeable the world is, and how solid, strong and impermeable God's kingdom is, and we belong to that kingdom. It's part of us now, and we will live in it for eternity. So we're blessed if we grieve, because we have this hope, this kingdom hope, this new thing being done in us and for us by Jesus, that turns the world upside down and sets us apart to be holy. This is not only comforting, but strengthening and empowering for now, giving us a sure foundation to build our lives on, and the wonderful promise of heaven in the company of our Jesus for the future. We need to hold firm to the anchor and remember the hope that Jesus gives. I found this prayer that I'd like to finish with. Lord Jesus, you are a shield around me, strong in love, heavy with power, shaped with hope, and gilded with truth. I will fear no evil, for you watch over me. You defend and deliver me. In this day, this hour, this moment, I put my trust in you. Amen.